Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to welcome you to the Krasno Global Event Series at UNC-Chapel Hill. It is wonderful to see you all online today. Today, our event comes from the Woodrow Wilson Center in downtown Washington, D.C. We have three distinguished guests today who will join us live from Kiev in Ukraine and from Jerusalem in Israel. I will introduce them to you in a minute. I'm Klaus Larres, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at UNC-Chapel Hill. At present, I'm a Global Europe and China Institute Fellow here at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. We have all been shocked by the terrible events in Israel and Gaza, which have unfolded since a devastating attack on innocent civilians in Israel on October the 7th. Since then, even more innocent Israeli and Palestinian civilians have been killed, including many children of all ages. The war in Ukraine has been going on for more than 18 months now. It all started in full with Russia's onslaught on Ukraine in February 2022. Many innocent Ukrainian civilians and soldiers have been killed, and much of the country has been destroyed. There are also many other areas of tension in the world, which could turn into a war-like situation at any time. Most often, Taiwan is mentioned in this context. But of course, the situation in Sudan, Myanmar, and many parts and countries in Africa in particular are also highly volatile. Thus, our world has become rather violent and aggressive. The so-called global order seems to have disappeared and is nowhere to be found. Today, we have three outstanding speakers in total, and two outstanding speakers from Kiev in Ukraine. That is Anna Shvetsova and Stephen Moore. And Professor Scott Ury is based in Jerusalem, Israel. Let me introduce our speakers briefly to you. Anna Shvetsova is Chief Operating Officer of the Ukraine Freedom Project. Anna facilitates the delivery of aid to the Ukrainian front, and she educates policymakers in Washington and elsewhere on the realities of Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. Prior to her job at the Ukraine Freedom Project, she was Chief Operating Officer at two Ukrainian startups. Stephen Moore is a founder of the Ukraine Freedom Project. Stephen has been in Ukraine since day 5 of the war, that is, since late February 2022. Prior to this, Stephen Moore was Chief of Staff to a leading Republican member of Congress in the U.S. House of Representatives. And Stephen also writes regularly most interesting articles on Substack. They are well worth investigating and reading. Professor Scott Ury joins us live from Jerusalem. Scott is an associate professor of modern Jewish history at Tel Aviv University, though he lives in Jerusalem. Scott Ury is also senior editor of the journal History and Memory. He recently spent some time at the Center of European Studies at Harvard, and that is where we first met. Scott has forewarned me and said that there are many air raid alarms in Jerusalem. So if he needs to suddenly head out to a bunker, then it's because of these alarms. It's not because he got fed up with our event. I would like to thank Anna, Stephen, and Scott for joining us today. Greatly appreciated. Before I pepper our three guests with some questions, let me just point out that, as always, we are videotaping the event today for our famous YouTube channel, on which the videos of all our events can be watched again and again. The address is youtube.com/KrasnoUNC. And as I always like to say, our YouTube channel is worthwhile checking out and watching as often as you possibly can. We have a great international Zoom audience today, and everyone is most welcome to submit your questions to our speakers today by making use of the chat function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our two Krasno assistants, Emma and Willow, will select your questions and read them out aloud to all of us. Scott, let me ask you straight away, what is the situation right now in Israel? What is the mood? How was President Biden's visit to Tel Aviv yesterday received?
So thanks, Klaus, and good evening to everyone, near and far, or far and farther away. Sound is okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, great. So the past 2 weeks have really been an emotional roller coaster for people living in Israel. I think the initial response was one of shock and disbelief as seeing the attack by Hamas The government didn't anticipate it, and certainly average citizens didn't anticipate it. Afterwards, I think the shock and disbelief passed quickly into some kind of sense of grief and horror when, after the second or third day, people became more and more aware of what the Hamas militants or terrorists or soldiers were doing as they entered these towns and villages alongside the Israeli-Gaza border. And over time, this grief and anger and horror kind of turned into a sense of resolve. This country, which was bitterly divided in Israel over the past 6 to 8 months, over a question of democratic reforms, the state of the judiciary, should there be an independent judiciary, has suddenly become much more of a unified, rallying country, which most of the people come to the consensus that across, and again, I haven't conducted polls, we're in the midst of things now, but the larger sense is that a great majority of the people here have, in light of these horrific events of the attacks on the civilians, attacks and the kidnapping of children, of older people, just put a shot up here of a friend of a son of a colleague of mine, Sigi Dekelchen, who lived in a kibbutz near the Gaza border and went missing since the first day. He's assumed to be in Gaza and one of the over 200 prisoners that the Hamas took, both young kids, all the way from people a year old to people in their 80s. And this exposure, or this shock, or this confrontation with the violence and the murders, burning people, and there's also stories of sexual violence, and also stories, unfortunately, of people being beheaded, led to a sense of unified, really resolve among most of the people in Israel. I think now people are rallying behind. The government has shifted. Netanyahu has added a new party to make a unity government, national unity government. And there's a sense of unity and resolve that there really is no point in coming to a kind of conversation or agreement with Hamas in general, because a party or an organization that's capable of attacking and murdering civilians, elderly people, disabled people, and young children is no organization that one can have any agreement with. And so that's where things stand over the past 2 weeks, Klaus, if I can say, from shock to horror to anger to resolve in one or a few sentences. My general impressions. I think Biden's visit was very well received. I think Biden expressed both in the States and here in Israel yesterday in Tel Aviv a strong support for Israel's interests, for Israel's existence, as it were. That support has come with a commitment for both support politically and also militarily. And it's also come with a few small conditions, which I think most people certainly now can live with. And that's where things stand. I certainly think he did a great job. I think he rose above and beyond what I think certainly much better than the previous president ever could have done in such a crisis situation. And we'll see, of course, if Biden and Blinken and their intervention here, both of them were here, can help move this crisis along and into somehow some kind of a less violent resolution of the current state of affairs.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you for this first-hand impression. The outrage and the rage in Israel is still fresh and new. It only happened on the 7th of October, not that long ago. In Ukraine, the war has been going on for 18 months and longer. So the outrage, the initial outrage, has given way to a different mood. Tell us, Anna, what is the mood? What is the situation like in Ukraine?
Thank you, Klaus, for the question. I would like to start that when we heard about brutal attack of Hamas on Israel on the 7th of October, we had flashbacks from the February 2022. The hearts of Ukrainians are with Israel now. We have advertising billboard changed now, and they show Israel flags now. And we pray for Israel, and we hope that you stop this evil like once and for good. We feel that we fight the same evil. When we hear about kidnapped people, kidnapped children, killed civilians, it's exactly what Russians are doing here. And it's really the same evil that we are fighting. We pray for Israel, and we hope we can fight this evil as soon as possible. As for the moods of Ukrainians here, we've been through a lot for these 600 days of war. But what I want to say is that, like, at the front lines here in Kiev, all the people, they are ready to do whatever is needed to defend our freedom. We will fight to the very end, even if government, for some reason, decides to stop the war. Ukrainians will not give up. These are the moods of the soldiers that we saw this weekend in Kherson. These are the moods of my colleagues who are fighting now at the front lines. Yes, we are tired, but we will not give up, because, like, the price that we paid is too high. Now we have to stop this war for good.
Thank you, Anna. Stephen, I'm sure you agree with that, but what is the situation at the front? What we hear here in the United States and elsewhere in Europe, for example, is that the counteroffensive hasn't really succeeded, that there is disappointment all around. Or what is the situation like? You're muted, yeah.
It works better when you press the mute button. Scott, yeah. And just want to say, the Israelis were among the first here in Ukraine. I came here on day 5 of the war, and many of the people I saw were Israelis, Jewish organizations. And I just want to pop up this picture real quick. You can see here, this is from March of last year. This is in Kiev. And that is an Israeli volunteer medical delegation, and that came and offered relief to the Ukrainian people. So there's a strong tie between Ukraine and Israel, and all of us are horrified here to see what's happening in Israel. Anna and I went to the front last weekend. We went to Kherson, and Kherson is still a very rough neighborhood. We've adopted a village down there called Pravdina, and we're that was under Russian occupation for about 9 months. So when I hear the stories of children being kidnapped in Israel, and the horrible things that the children are having to go through, I'm reminded of the children of this village, Pravdina, and who they tell horrific stories of having to hide in their basements, being sheltered by their parents' bodies while Russian shelling was happening, and even more, some of them located the Russian ammo depot and gave that information to their parents, who gave them to the Ukrainian army and destroyed the ammo depot. So the children are both brave as victims, and they're brave as fighters. And so that's kind of some of the stuff we're seeing here. And the people at the front, the soldiers, if we give them the weapons they need, they will win. And I want to emphasize that. I think in America, there's not a lot of good information about what's happening in Ukraine and who's winning. And I just want to, I'll share another map here on the screen. This is on your left. That's the zenith of Russian occupation, March 26th, 2022. And on the right, this is a recent, from last month. This is a recent map. You can see there's a lot less red. And, right in that star where Kiev is, that's where Anna and I are right now. When I first got here in March of last year, there was rockets, there was artillery, and now Kiev is a highly functioning city. And I don't think a lot of people realize that, but the Ukrainians have taken our weapons, our aid, and put them to good use.
Thanks, Stephen. What about the counteroffensive? How successful or how not successful has it been? Is it still coming, or what can we expect?
Well, and I'll tell you this, the counteroffensive was hyped and fell short. And it does not look like the previous counteroffensive. In the previous counteroffensive, there was Kherson taken back. That was in November of last year. Kharkiv around the same time. There's massive amounts of territory taken back. And because of the time between the first counteroffensive and the second one, the Russians have been able to dig in. So And if you're a NATO general or an Israeli general, you want, if you're going to do a counteroffensive like that, you want number superiority, artillery superiority, or air superiority. And currently the Ukrainians do not have any of those things. So they're fighting valiantly against the entrenched Russians to try to get through and get across the Dnieper River. But what's missing in this conversation is the victories they're having with the weapons they do have. As one example, they have taken out about 5 times the amount of Russian artillery since May that they did in April. So just to clarify that, they're targeting Russian artillery and taking it out at a high rate. So in order to achieve that artillery superiority. The other thing that's happening, there's a lot of drone strikes inside Russia. And I think the untold story of this conflict, of this war, is the Ukrainian Navy. And I say that kind of farcically, because Ukraine's Navy is smaller than that of the almost landlocked desert country of Jordan. And yet they have taken out not 1, but 2 Russian flagships. And they have taken out a Kilo-class submarine and about 20 other ships, along with the Black Sea Fleet headquarters. And they killed the admiral commanding the Black Sea Fleet. So the victories in the counteroffensive are where the Ukrainians have superiority. And that's what we're looking at right now.
Let me follow up. The aim was, if I understand it correctly, to get to Crimea, to cut off the 2 parts which are occupied by Russian, which gives them access to Crimea, and reconquer Crimea. Is that still realistic, or was that ever realistic?
I think it's still realistic. And I think that, again, when the Ukrainians get the weapons they need, they win. And unfortunately, tanks were promised in January, and they got here last week. F-16s were a bad idea in February of this year. They were a good idea in May, and they're still not here. So therein lies the problem, is that, and according to the Washington Post, the Ukrainians got about 15% of the demining equipment that they requested. So, so the Ukrainians are doing the best they can with what they've got. And is it still realistic? Yeah, let's see what the tanks do. Let's see what the F-16s do. And I think we might see something.
Thank you. Scott, let me ask you, right now we are still waiting for some sort of major invasion of the Israeli forces of the Gaza Strip. What do people in Israel expect? What kind of invasion will it be? Of course, no one knows for sure, but what is the general consensus? What will happen? And how difficult will it be? Urban warfare is by its very nature extremely difficult. Has Israel the resources, the capability of actually succeeding in that?
That is the question of the hour, and it's been horribly complicated by the aforementioned hostages. The numbers of today are that there are over 200 Israeli hostages, held most likely by Hamas. These people and their whereabouts and their status has not been confirmed. And so Mr. Netanyahu is still the prime minister, although he has a new expanded coalition in national unity government, has a huge dilemma on his hands. What does he go for? Does he negotiate and try to liberate these hostages through some kind of swap with Hamas of people who are held in Israeli prisons? Or does he go in for, and here you see the Gaza Strip here between Egypt and Israel, and the Mediterranean Sea, for a full-on ground invasion to once and for all, for the 5th time, in the past 12 or 14 years of skirmishes or conflicts between Israel and Hamas? Does he finally go in and try to go for the knockout punch, as it were? And please forgive my sports analogy. Sometimes words fail us in these Zoom events. I think it was fortunate, as I mentioned in the earlier discussion, that Biden and Blinken picked up and came over and are doing as much as they can. And I believe that I'm sure the Egyptians and Qatar and other international players are also trying to do as much as they can to either forestall the invasion or to move the negotiations about the hostages along. I'm not a big fan of Israel's current prime minister, although Klaus told me to keep my personal politics out of the presentation. But I don't envy him right now. This is a horrible decision. I think somewhere along the lines in classes on political science or military war colleges, the decisions and this horrible conflict will be taught in a more removed fashion. But what do you do if you're the leader and you're presented with either trying to save and negotiate 200 people's lives, everyone again, kidnapping children, all the way to grandparents, or do you actually amass up troops and go for a final invasion to wipe out an enemy which is even worse than you ever imagined in its violence, in its hatred, in its willingness to use what up until 10 days ago was unimaginable violence, at least in this conflict, at least for me. I can say, and it's no secret, that troops have been amassed. Israel, as some of you know, has a standing army, but an even larger set of reserves. Most males are drafted, about 2/3 of Israeli males are drafted into the army, a little bit less than 50% of the women. Many of them continue after their 2 or 3 years to do reserve duty into 40s, into their 50s, some of them even into the 60s if they volunteer. I did it into my early 40s, as it were. And hundreds of thousands of people have been drafted right now and are waiting on the border for instructions to invade or not. And to the extent that the Israeli economy is not in full swing anymore, all universities have postponed the beginning of the academic year because so many students or post-army students have been drafted into reserves. So many teaching assistants and graduate students have been drafted into reserves. So many professors have been drafted into reserves that there's really no way that university can actually undertake and begin the school year right now. And so they have had the massive buildup. They have basically, or perhaps the best situation internationally that Israel's had, at least in my humble, simple opinion, in the past, in the known and recent past. America is behind them, Britain is behind them, Germany is behind them. And so if they're going to go for a land invasion to try to push back Hamas and to try to depose Hamas, this seems like this might be an opportunity. However, Klaus is right. It has been hesitant to go in for long-term land invasions in the past, exactly because it's not only urban warfare, but perhaps Hamas, which you can say a lot of things about it, its cruelty, its depravity, its use, its capture, and its kidnapping of children, and its abuse of children and women when invading these civilian towns in Israel 10 days ago, in some cases, but they are a very shrewd political organization. The way they master the invasion, the way they've spawned out and attacked Israel in over 20 different locations, leads me and other people to believe that they've thought about, well, what happens next? And perhaps taking over 200 hostages was not just a ploy for negotiations, which has been used in the Middle East and elsewhere in the past, but perhaps it's actually bait for a trap to drag Israel's standard tank-driven heavy army into Gaza and into perhaps an urban warfare that may not be able to get out of. I don't know. As I said a few sentences ago, I actually don't envy Mr. Netanyahu or his defense minister. These are very difficult decisions. But certainly looks like they're preparing for some kind of massive assault. And as I mentioned earlier, the tone and the atmosphere in Israel has changed radically in the past 10 days or 2 weeks. If there were some people, including the prime minister and his cabinet, who felt you could negotiate and come to some kind of modus vivendi understanding with Hamas up until 2 weeks ago, that's off the table. And if the people right next door to you are able and willing and interested in committing such horrific crimes against men, women, and children, well, if you're any kind of leader, you have to do something. So that's the dilemma.
Thank you, Scott.
We will see.
You said rightly, at the moment, Israel enjoys the support of many countries around the world, particularly influential Western countries. But how long is that going to continue if there is a massive death of civilians, innocent Palestinian women, children, men? And how long will that support endure? Because when you look what's happening in the so-called global South, there is a lot of sympathy for Palestinians, even for Hamas, while Israel is not the flavor of the month. That is already the state. So could that not develop in a way which would be devastating for Israel's chances of success, not to speak of its image?
I think you're absolutely right. And that's a third factor that you're right. And I should have mentioned is how do you go after Hamas without affecting and basically inflicting violence upon the hundreds of thousands or millions of Palestinians in Gaza who basically want to get on with their lives. And this is, again, how Hamas perhaps is the small underground militant Islamic organization is dictating the pace and the direction of the Middle East and perhaps our world, right? You're right. They've set up perfect. Israel's damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. If it sits back and does nothing, if it goes in, as Klaus said, and it ends up killing, God forbid, innocent civilians, more innocent civilians, then it loses support and incurs anger in the Middle East, in Europe, and elsewhere. If it doesn't do anything and Hamas remains, then what are the prospects for any kind of reasonable situation for Israel in the near future? You're absolutely right. I think, this is, I assume, something that Blinken and Biden discussed with Netanyahu and his cabinet over the past week. What is the parameters of this operation? What are they going to be? Obviously, it was not there. But I do think, again, Israel is a divided country with a lot of people with a lot of opinions, but I think the general consensus now, in wake of the assaults by Hamas of last Saturday or 2 Saturdays ago, is that if something needs to be done to take care of this issue, and if not now, then it's just going to come back to haunt Israel in the very near future.
And the other question which also needs to be answered is, even if Israel is successful as intended and wipes out Hamas, who is going to run the Gaza Strip afterwards? Who is the government of Gaza in the future? Will it be an Israeli occupation, an Israeli pseudo government, or will it be something new, or will it be Mr. Abbas from the West Bank who runs Gaza? All these questions, I think, need to be addressed. I'm not sure that any answer has been found so far.
I don't think any answer has been found. I think Biden hinted a week ago when he was I believe in the 60 Minutes interview or one of his press conferences from the state, both of which were strongly supportive of Israel. I think Biden came out flat and said Israel should not occupy Gaza or reoccupy Gaza. Keep in mind, Israel left under Ariel Sharon's government in 2005, left Gaza unilaterally. This is perhaps part of this is the source of the problem. Then 2 years later, Hamas took over the Gaza Strip from Fatah, from the Palestinian Authority. I obviously Israel shouldn't go back and reoccupy Gaza. That would be a huge mess. Who then steps in the place of Hamas? I don't know if anyone is going to do that right now and how they make that happen, but that needs to be a solution. The solution both in Gaza and the West Bank needs to be Palestinian self-rule, in my opinion. Right? Obviously, this horrible attack and slaughter of civilians in Israel has its source in this long-term conflict, which needs to be resolved. And that's what really needs to be resolved somehow. Mm-hmm. Right? Without a resolution of the conflict, it will just come back to haunt Israel again.
Thank you. Israel has strong support worldwide, at least at the moment. That was also the case with Ukraine at the beginning of the war and many months into the war. But now when we look at the opinion polls in Western countries, including the United States, including in the US Congress, support seems to be waning, not because the cause isn't seen as justified anymore, but people get frustrated, get drawn out, they get impatient. Someone said strategic patience is not what Western public opinion has, and sometimes even Western politicians don't have anymore. Anna, so are you fearful that support for Ukraine is waning and that in the end the Ukrainians will be forced to enter into some sort of compromise deal, not least because Western support is declining?
We hope not, and here is why. Ukrainians see ourselves as partners of the United States of America in defeating our long-term adversary, Russia. America provides weapons, but we provide the lives of our very best people. We, along with the global coalition, we should show Russia and other terroristic organizations like Hamas and other governments which want war, that there is no place for war in modern world. So the response should be not only from Ukraine, but from global coalition. And that is why we hope that Israel will defeat Hamas here now for good too.
Thank you. Stephen, you know the US House of Representatives very well indeed, as you worked in Congress for many years. So tell us, what is the mood as far as you can judge, and will it really undermine the Ukrainian war effort?
Yeah, that's a good question, one we're all concerned about. In my view, Israel and Ukraine are two fronts in the same war. And I'll show you, if you'll allow me, just do another quick screen share. This is two people that none of us like spending time together. And I think that Americans are beginning to realize that this is all related, that you've got a coalition of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and other countries that are causing mayhem in the world. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. Now, in terms of congressional support, we've seen, congressional support's gone down. And there's been 9 opportunities in Congress to vote for or against aid to Ukraine. And at this point, 138 Republicans have voted against aid to Ukraine at least once. And in the last bill, which was a couple of weeks ago, that was aid to Ukraine, a $300 million standalone bill for training for Ukrainian troops that came out of the Defense Appropriations Bill. There's 117 Republicans that voted against that. Now, what does that mean when they voted against it? It means that most Republicans we talked to, and Anna and I were in Washington, D.C. A couple of weeks back and wore out a lot of shoes, let's say, talking to people in Congress, going from door to door. And people in Congress want to do the right thing. There's about 50 members of the House of Representatives on the Republican side who are pretty hardcore against Ukraine, that have voted no every opportunity. The rest of them are people that want to do the right thing, but they're getting very negative feedback on Ukraine from their constituents, from the people that voted for them. And the House of Representatives was designed to be responsive to the voters, because they've got elections every 2 years. So that is a problem. And the problem stems from Kremlin propaganda effectively being propagated in the conservative ecosphere of news. And Tucker Carlson is one name that is pretty obvious to us all. And Tucker says something, he gets 10 million viewers, and people call their congressman saying, "Why aren't you doing what Tucker says?" And that's very difficult to deal with. So we've seen in March of last year, Trump voters had the highest opinion. They were the biggest fan of Vladimir Zelensky. Now they are at the bottom. Trump voters do not like Zelensky. And so we've seen that atrophy over the last 18 months.
Why have they focus on Zelensky? Why would they not like Zelensky as a person?
Well, and again, that's some very effective propaganda that gets out there. You know, the Russians tie Zelensky with Hollywood, and Republicans don't like Hollywood. You know, see, he's a Hollywood comedian, just like, you know, he's a comedian just like Hollywood. You know, there's all kinds of extremely negative information out there. My mother, who is 89 years old, a conservative Christian, forwarded me a photo of Zelensky at his desk with a Scarface style mound of cocaine on his desk. And, you know, she said, "Do you think Zelensky's a cocaine addict?" I was like, "Mom, let me tell you about Photoshop." So, you know, that is what's getting out there. And so the Russians have done a very effective hatchet job on Zelensky.
You think that Zelensky is Jewish? And now we have the rise of anti-Semitism regarding the recent incidents in Israel, Gaza. Do you think there is a connection, or people try to bring that together?
Yeah, that's above my pay grade. I have not seen specific anti-Semitism in relation to the Republicans who are tired of Zelensky. It's more like the guy's coming around begging sort of stuff. But the interesting thing when you talk about the atrophying of support, support for Ukraine was pretty strong for the first several months. But we've already seen so both sides have their extreme wings, and the Republicans, there's about 50 Republicans who are anti-Ukraine and are extreme on their stances. Then just recently, 55 Democrats came out with a letter to President Biden urging restraint on the side of Israel. Don't harm civilians, do everything you can not to harm civilians, that sort of thing. So that sort of opposition to Ukraine didn't happen for a few months. And so Israel has both excellent mechanisms in the United States with AIPAC for building relationships and getting out the story about what's happening in Israel. And they have some deeply entrenched people on the progressive side in America who don't like what they're doing.
Thanks. Do you think there's also a lack of or waning support in Europe, or is that just an American phenomenon or a House of Representatives phenomenon?
Well, if Europe had been more quick to support Ukraine, then we might not be seeing so much atrophy in the House of Representatives. That's one of the things they complain about is like, what about France? What about Germany? And, one of my least favorite days in the Ukraine war was one of the first days that Putin started saber rattling, talking about using nuclear weapons. And France responded, if Putin uses nuclear weapons, France will not retaliate. And I'm sitting here in Kiev and I'm thinking, retaliate or don't retaliate, but for gosh sakes, don't tell them, So French in particular support for Ukraine has been really frustrating. I think the rest of Europe has finally come around and started doing what needs to be done.
What about the squabble between Poland and Ukraine? That doesn't seem to be too promising either, is it?
I am not an expert on Polish politics, but I know a lot of people who are. They tell me that is internal politics of one party trying to get turnout increased from the rural vote, and that's why they beat up on Ukraine because of the grain deal with Ukraine. So I am hopeful and confident that now that the elections have taken place, that we'll see less of that sort of nonsense.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go back to Scott. You mentioned, quite rightly, of course, in Hamas and the problem Hamas poses. There's also Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then there's, of course, the West Bank. So we have really a problem or three problems for Israel to deal with, three divergent, though kind of similar movements in a way. Can you explain to us what is the difference between Hamas and Hezbollah and also the issue of the West Bank, and how can possibly any country deal with that and bring it all into some sort of peaceful, relatively peaceful solution?
So, right, I'll do my best. It's not an easy question, and it's not my main field of specialization. I think, as you may know, I think both Hamas and Hezbollah are militant Islamic organizations. Hamas in Gaza has been operating since basically the late 1980s, was active in the first Intifada, was active in the second Intifada in derailing the peace process, and it's active now in Gaza perhaps to derail perhaps what's a burgeoning Saudi-Israeli agreement or deal. Hezbollah is based in basically southern Lebanon. It's also a militant Islamic organization. Both of them are certainly aligned with Iran and armed by Iran and perhaps other parties, perhaps Russia. I don't know enough, and we don't know enough about the arms which are being used. And right now what Israel's trying to do, or perhaps step back one or two sentences, perhaps in some of the thinking in Israel is the reason why Israel is so surprised by the Hamas invasion from Gaza of 2 weeks ago is it was preoccupied with what was happening in the north with Hezbollah and in the West Bank with the Palestinian Authority, right? So it had removed troops or moved its focus to the West Bank and the Lebanese border in the north. Maybe it's making me dizzy. Maybe I'll pull up the map again. So Hezbollah is based here in southern Lebanon, and of course Gaza is here with Hamas. And I think this is one thing that Biden has been emphasizing again and again in his public statements and in his shuttle diplomacy, is to try to get Israel not to open a second front against Hezbollah, to try to get Israel to focus on really either redeeming and negotiating the release of the hostages, or taking care of Hamas once and for all, or both, and not to start a two-front or three-front war. And there's also Biden's role in repeatedly warning, or basically warning, Hezbollah and perhaps its supporters not to push Hezbollah into a northern invasion of Israel. At the same time, there's also massive buildup of Israeli troops in the north to protect the settlements of the Israeli north, both in the Israeli south here by Gaza and the north here. We have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Israeli citizens who have been relocated in the past 2 weeks. They moved to the center, they moved to Jerusalem, they moved all over the country where they're out of harm's way. The north is simmering, but it's not as bad. But the northern border of Hezbollah is simmering, but it's not as bad, certainly, as Gaza was 2 weeks ago. And of course, also, we have the West Bank, where the Palestinian Authority and Mahmoud Abbas have been in control for the past 20 years or so, for the most part. Now, while relations between Israel and the Palestinian Authority are not great, and while Palestinian Authority West Bank would like more rights, and Israel is hesitant to give them some of those military and economic rights, I think the lesson of the last 2 weeks is, well, it's much better. The relationship with the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank has worked out much better, obviously, than certainly what's happening with Gaza and Hamas. So if there is to be some kind of resolution of the situation, I think it needs to be certainly encouraging and working towards Palestinian self-determination in the West Bank, and also over time in Gaza, although obviously not with Hamas. And that needs to be Israel's goal. And so one of the questions earlier appeared in the chat about how long Israel should be in the West Bank, in Gaza, as little as possible. I think the longer it's going to be in Gaza, if it goes in, the more difficult it's going to be to step out, right? So the main difference here, and of course you need to know, and you probably understand quite well, that Hamas and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank also don't get along so well at times. And in fact, for a while, or in the very beginning in 2005, when Israel left Israel left Gaza, the Palestinian Authority was in charge. And 2 years later, Hamas took over, kicked the Palestinian Authority out, and took control of Gaza. There was also tension there as well.
Yeah, I was briefly in Ramallah and the West Bank last year, and the tension was palpable. Nothing happened, but you could hear when you talk particularly to young men how frustrated they were about the situation, and they wasted life chances. You know, they were wasting their time away. The United States pays a lot of military aid to Israel, but also to Egypt. So why can't the United States simply tell both countries, you have really to make sure that the Palestinian innocent civilians, women, children, get water, get medicine, get food and electricity. Otherwise, we will simply stop military aid. You know, why doesn't the United States, for the sake of civilians, play hardball, both with Israel, but also with Egypt? And Egypt, of course, has the other opening to the Gaza, the border opening to the Gaza Strip. They could let these trucks through, and they could have let them through days ago, I would say.
Right. I think, again, one of Biden's main goals in visiting Israel yesterday, I believe it was, at the time kind of loses its sense and its proportion these days and age, was to encourage and to convince Israel to open again the borders and to allow for humanitarian aid into Gaza, despite Israel's efforts to squeeze out Hamas and to basically chase Hamas and or rid Gaza of Hamas. Why Egypt is not opening its borders and allowing civilians who would like to leave and then return, or leave and flee into either Egyptian-controlled Sinai or other parts of Egypt, I mean, I can only conjecture why they're not doing that, right? I think you can guess as well. It doesn't, I think, they don't want to perhaps be seen as being aiding Israel in its effort to basically eliminate Hamas, perhaps. Perhaps it fears that if these refugees, people leave, if some of the 2 million residents of Gaza leave Gaza for Egypt, they may not return for whatever reason. So I'm not really sure if I can speak to all.
That is
I think you can imagine as well. But
yeah,
certainly one of Biden's main goals and one of his main achievements was to convince the Israeli government, led Netanyahu today, to allow more humanitarian aid into Gaza and to prevent some kind of humanitarian disaster. And again, this is one of the ways which Hamas is kind of basically dictating the agenda here. Israel's damned if it does and damned if it doesn't. If it goes in and tries to seek out and attack Hamas leaders innocent civilians will clearly be killed because it's a densely populated urban population, and Hamas is deeply entrenched in many cases in hundreds of miles of underground tunnels, right? And if it doesn't go in, who's basically to guarantee Israel that this kind of attack is not going to happen 6 months or 18 months or 2 years later, right? Egypt has always had a difficult relationship with the Palestinians for decades, right? They're not opening the Egyptian border. They're not letting them come into Egypt freely. So it's also not, again, nobody wants millions of refugees. Very few countries want millions of refugees in a country apart from Poland, perhaps. But you can't expect every country to be Poland. What can I say?
Yeah, no, I didn't mean that the Egyptians should let 2 million Palestinians into their country. This is kind of, and they probably wouldn't return. That is kind of understandable. But to not let humanitarian aid in, these 50 trucks which seem to be waiting at the border, that I think is the issue which needs to be resolved urgently. And hopefully, as you said, Biden got some sort of deal going. I would like to encourage our viewers to submit questions because we will turn to the Q&A session in a minute. Just put your question down in writing and we will read them out aloud to our 3 excellent expert speakers. But before we do so, I would like to ask Anna, what actually is the Ukraine Freedom Project? You and Stephen are very active in that project. And what do you actually do and why is it so helpful? Yeah, Anna, please.
Ukraine Freedom Project was started by Stephen Moore. He came to Ukraine on the 5th day of the war to help his friends. And when all of them were evacuated in safe places, he stayed because he saw that there is unlimited need for help. He started his fund, which he joined this summer. And before that, he was running humanitarian, giving humanitarian aid to the front lines, non-lethal equipment to soldiers, which we are still doing. And in addition to that, we also do bring good information from what is happening here in Ukraine to the decision makers in the United States.
Okay, thank you. Stephen, you're the founder. Would you like to add to that?
She does a good job on her own. I will say though that I've been here since day 5 of the war. I've seen everything. I've been to the front a whole bunch of times, and I'm just struck by the similarities from what I'm hearing from Scott and from what I've seen over time, and the willingness of Hamas to just use human life to their own political ends is just shocking and reminiscent of what the Russians do. I mean, the Russians are still using 16th century military tactics, which is take a bunch of farmers and put people with machine guns behind them, or put people, and force them to the front and to attack. And these people just get, Anya and I know people who are at the front right now who are sickened because they just have to shoot so many people. Many of them are unarmed, and so it is, but they're coming across the line. You either shoot them because they're coming at you, or if you don't, they're going to come at you. But so it's just disgusting the way that these two evil entities that are causing so many problems in the world are just disrespectful to human lives.
Thanks. We saw pro-Hamas or pro-Palestinian demonstrations and rioting in many cities in the recent past, in the last few days. We also see that President Putin in Russia seems to be much less isolated than the Western world tried to make him by imposing sanctions, by cutting off travel opportunities and cutting off the Russian banking system from much of the world. How was that achieved, that he is not as isolated than he should be from the point of view of Washington and most other capitals?
Well, let's just say that the trade relationship between Germany and Kazakhstan has increased dramatically since February of 2022. Why is that? Gee, hard to say. Maybe it's because there's such a big market for German semiconductors in Kazakhstan. More likely, these are used as a waypoint to get these things to Russia and Putin so that they can build more rockets and build more missiles that kill more Ukrainians. Anna spent the first part of the war in Switzerland, and Anna, what did we learn about Switzerland?
Swiss people are great people, but there are, according to NECO organization, there are around 400 billion of Russian oligarchs' money being laundered in Switzerland now. And this money is used to buy these semiconductors and equipment to kill Ukrainians. So like Swiss people are super supportive, but there are sanctions which do not work. And sanctions will work, like they will weaken Russia if they work. But we see that like we do not have control over some countries. And we know that Russia, we run an investigation about all the equipment that Russia brings here, all the drones, all the missiles that they send us, we investigate where the details are coming from. And unfortunately, they are coming from all over the world, from different countries, through Turkey, through Kazakhstan, through China. So like although governments are not supporting, they're imposing sanctions, but companies are finding way to trade with Russia still. So Russia still gets the fuel to run this war.
So what you're saying is that greed and making money is running supreme.
For some companies still, like many companies, they still run operations in Russia and pay taxes and which are used to kill Ukrainians. So I do not understand why, because like it's most black and white war since World War II. Like
Thank you.
And let me just add real quickly to that. Procter & Gamble is the parent company of Gillette. Gillette, as you may recall, about 5 years ago on the Super Bowl, made a commercial about toxic masculinity that was very preachy. The biggest plant for Gillette razors in the world is in St. Petersburg. And Gillette pays about $5 million a year in taxes to Russia for Russia to use. That's a whole lot of Shahed drones that Russia can buy and send over here. So there's a lot of companies like Procter & Gamble that have one corporate ethos that they tell people about, and then they ignore it when it becomes too much of a problem for their bottom line.
If this is all correct, then hopefully these companies are listening to what you just said and think about it and change their ways of doing business. We are going to our Q&A session, and I would like Willow and Emma to perhaps read out the first question to us. Do you want to start, Emma?
Yes, of course. So Patrick asks, are there any non-violent Palestinian leaders like MLK, Gandhi, or Mandela can we support? They were, and notes that they were vilified and jailed by their countries before being accepted internationally.
Who would like to? Okay,
is that
Scott,
for me?
Scott, you volunteer. Please go ahead.
Resident expert. That's a great question. I think that's something that Israel needs to pursue and to encourage, is a strong dialogue with Palestinians in the West Bank and hopefully soon in Gaza, who are willing to come to some kind of agreement, some kind of cooperative agreement with Israel about living together in this region in some kind of it's going to take some time, but in some kind of way of basically living together alongside one another with the West Bank and Israel and Gaza, and working towards some kind of peaceful arrangement. Obviously, even if Hamas is defeated, hopefully, in my opinion, It's not going to guarantee any peace for Israel. As I just mentioned 5 minutes ago, there's Hezbollah, and as Klaus mentioned, as well, there's also tension in the West Bank. So Israel needs to seek out these partners and encourage and support them with the help of international partners, clearly.
Thank
Or
you.
at least in my opinion.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's have another question, Willow, please.
So actually building off of that, James Evans asks whether or not the state solution remains possible, whether or not that even be a possibility, and whether there is a real commitment to that ultimate goal from both Israel and the larger Palestinian community.
Sure, there has been a lot of discussion over the past 2 decades since the end of the Oslo Accords, basically, with the Second Intifada, so almost 20 years, basically, more or less, since the end of Second Intifada, give or take a year or two, about whether or not there can actually be a peaceful two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, Israel being more or less where it is right now, with some changes, Palestine being basically the West Bank and or Gaza. That's not entirely clear. The change, or the larger change, that's happened in the past 15, 20 years, has over time has been with the demise, or since the demise of the Oslo Accords, in wake of perhaps the Second Intifada and other developments, has been an increase of Israeli Jewish settlers living in the West Bank, further complicating matters for perhaps a continuous two-state solution. This is further complicated by the fact that, again, Israelis aren't really talking about the day after right now. They're more talking about basically what's happening vis-a-vis Gaza. And so people aren't really talking about the day after, but I can certainly envision a situation in which people who are hesitant to support the two-state solution will point to the events of 2 weeks ago and Hamas's invasion and saying, we'd love for there to be a two-state solution, but how can you guarantee to me that this isn't going to happen again? So it's going to be difficult. It's not going to happen overnight. I'm still hopeful that it will happen. And this is going to mean actually some kind of population exchange right now. You have in the West Bank several 100,000 Jewish Israelis living in the West Bank. And they're going to either have to come to some kind of creative map, as it were, which they had in the days of Camp David, the second Camp David, and the Y discussion and the Y plantation discussions between Clinton and Arafat and Ehud Barak. There were creative discussions about blocks of settlements, with some settlements and some blocks of settlements, Israeli settlements remaining, and some being evacuated. That's hopefully the best case scenario. Whether or not some kind of future government in Israel is going to abide, I'm not so sure. Klaus is his scholar of political history. I mean, how do you expect a population to respond over this type of attack? My sense is that it's going to lurch. I mean, again, I study history, not the future, but my sense, or I wouldn't be surprised if Israeli society moves to the right out of fear in the next near future. It needs to be pulled back into some kind of community and some kind of arrangement with the Palestinians. And this is where Biden and Blinken were actually quite brilliant. I mean, Biden getting on a plane and coming to Israel and reassuring Israel that the United States and Biden is in favor of Israel, it will eventually give them the confidence to make these concessions, to make these changes. But right now, it all depends, of course, of how things play out. I mean, right now, it is Thursday, October 19th, and things are in a state of suspension. We're not sure what the next week is going to play out, what's going to entail, and what's going to happen, and how it's going to play out.
Thanks, Scott. Isn't Netanyahu discredited because of that huge intelligence failure? Do you see his popularity going up if the country moves the right way?
Well, his popularity certainly is an all-time low, or his lack of popularity is at an all-time high. I think many people in Israel, or the general consensus in Israel, is they were so concerned. Of course, it depends if you're pro-Netanyahu or anti-Netanyahu. The general consensus is that he was so concerned with keeping his government together and keeping himself out of jail with these different charges for bribery and corruption that he lost basically focus on what he really needs to be doing, which is protecting people from potentially hostile entities on all three borders, or at least two borders, Hezbollah and Hamas. However, Netanyahu has been around, has been prime minister since basically since the earlier century. He was prime minister in the 20th century. So he's a two-century prime minister. And if he's able to either secure the release of many or most or all of these hostages, if he's able somehow to actually defeat Hamas, then some things may be forgotten. I don't know. My sense is right now he's completely discredited. Right now he's not even facing or engaging with the public. But, you never know. You never know. He might come back, right?
Thank you. Let me ask Stephen and Anna about the popularity of President Zelensky. We hear conflicting stories in the Western world. Some say praise him and he's the greatest leader there has been, a second Churchill, and others think the exact opposite, that he is really a loser who isn't really capable of being a leader. How do you see that, and how do the Ukrainian people see that?
Great question. I think the best way to answer is to answer this question is to answer what do we think about presidential elections, which are scheduled to be in 2024. And Ukrainians are known to be the nation that protested twice. We had 2 revolutions because of unfair elections. And if we didn't like something, we would be on the streets already. Like we did it twice, we will do it 3rd time. What we think about elections and what we think about like this question now is that military is extremely popular, and the guys who should run for presidential elections for president, they are somewhere most probably at the front lines now. The cost of elections is $135 million. And we would rather buy Atacams and F-16s for this money and bring the victory closer. 8 million people left Ukraine, and we cannot guarantee them, we cannot give them voice, they're refugees. Security, we cannot provide security for the voters during the wartime. So it's extremely expensive. It's not time for this. If we didn't like president, if we didn't like something, we will be on the streets. You will not see any demonstrations, any protests. We are working on the victory full time, and like it's not our pain at all.
Okay, thanks very much. Can we have another question, Emma, please?
Yes, so anonymous attendee asked, how likely is an Iranian military intervention in Israel or Palestine? And what wider implication would this have for the attention and support to Ukrainian efforts to defeat Russia?
Yeah, then maybe we should ask both Stephen and Scott, because Iran, of course, plays also a role in providing missiles against Ukraine. Who would like to start? Stephen, maybe.
Well, listen, I have no idea the likelihood. I'm sure Scott has a very much more developed opinion on the likelihood that his country and Iran are going to go at it. You know, from what I see here in Ukraine, we would love that here. And listen, I am very familiar with the sound of Shahed drones. I have friends that we saw last night actually that have a machine gun installation on the top of a apartment building in Kiev, and they use it to shoot down Shahed drones. So I think that if Iran were neutralized, that would be good for Ukraine, bad for Russia, and good for the world, and presumably good for Israel. And now, what's the likelihood of Israel and Iran clashing? Scott, I leave that to you.
Oh, this is, again, as you said earlier, this is way above my pay grade. I certainly hope it doesn't happen. I certainly hope that Biden's advice and Biden's presence and Blinken's presence and the role of other political actors is going to keep this as a conflict between Israel and Hamas, and to keep this local. If it does go beyond Israel and Gaza's borders, then I'm not really sure what it's going to lead to, and I don't even want to think of what it might lead to. It could get very ugly very quickly. Bringing Iran and Russia into a conflict in the Middle East. I mean, Klaus, this is everyone's nightmare of the Cold War occurring all over again. Is this what we're seeing here? Is a new Cuban Missile Crisis relocated to the Middle East? Again, this is why it was important for Biden to come. This is why it's important for his clear public statements telling basically Hamas's and Hezbollah sponsors to keep at bay. Israel throughout the Ukraine and Russian war has tried to keep Russia out of the conflict, has tried not to antagonize Russia. I think it's clear that basically that policy had completely failed or was moderately successful in the short term. What Iran's goals are, I'm not really sure. What I've been reading and what we can all read in the local and international press is that no one thinks Iran was completely behind this attack on Israel by Hamas, but that doesn't mean it's not behind it now. That doesn't mean it can't be dragged into a larger global conflict. And that is where we are. This is on this edge of a conflict which may spin out of control. You can, as everyone on the screen and everyone in the room knows, in the Zoom room knows, this is the cliche of political science. You can start a war, but you don't know how it's going to end. Right?
Stephen.
Klaus, let me just jump in real quick. One of the things that is pertinent to our discussion here that hasn't been noticed much because of everything else going on is the release of a document called America's Strategic Posture. And that is done by a congressional commission that has been looking at America's military and what our capabilities are and how they would respond to threats that are posed in this era. And their thesis is that somewhere between 2027 and 2035, there's going to be a really destructive series of events between America, Middle Eastern actors, China, Russia, and I mean that's what we're seeing, and this is something that is going to get worse in my view. And I hate saying this because I'm a very optimistic man, and I always like to look at the bright side of things. But it's difficult for me to see how this doesn't get worse before it gets better. It's difficult to see how other actors are not drawn into this situation as people in command of these, authoritarian countries see opportunities for them to be aggressive. And so, I would commend everybody, just Google America's Strategic Posture, and it came out a couple of days ago.
Thank you. And regarding Iran has said if there was a ground invasion and the destruction of Hamas, then they would feel obliged to come in. But apparently through back channels, it has been made clear to the Iranians from the American intelligence community and other, probably the military, that if they did come in, that would have very negative consequences for Iran. And hopefully that will prevent such an outcome. But of course, one doesn't know. But everyone expects some devious involvement of Iran and tries its best to prevent it. We will see whether success is around the corner. Willow, do we have another question, please?
Yes, we've been getting quite a few questions and concerns in the chat about the humanitarian crisis for Palestinian innocents, particularly with the situation in Gaza. Brian Kilev has a question about proportionality in this regard. Have Israel's responses to the Hamas so far been proportional, and should they even be?
That's a good question, and it certainly comes up quite a bit. I think in the mindset of the Israeli government and the military, the goal is not a question of retribution or revenge on the Palestinian people in any way, shape, or form. I think the vast majority of people in Israel want to believe and hope that the vast majority of people in Gaza want to live in peace. The question is, what do you do with this government and or this organization, which has clearly shown that it's determined to use basically terror, kidnapping of children, sexual assault, kidnap and murder of entire families around the corner or next door to your house. And so the question isn't one really a proportional response, as may have been used perhaps, or may have been seen in the past, but one of a strategy, a political strategy and a military strategy. What do you do with this if your neighbor, if the organization on your border is hell-bent upon basically either raining terror and or, God forbid, eliminating your current state of government? And so the response then is needs to be, and this is Biden's argument, and this is really where he came in with a condition for Israel to again attempt and to try as much as it can to keep civilians out of this mess. The Israeli government and military, whether you buy it or not is another story, says this is why for the past week we've been telling people living in the northern part of the Gaza Strip to flee to the southern part of the Gaza Strip. Of course, there are larger arguments about what does that really mean, but then in their mind or in their argument is that if the civilians flee, then we can focus on weeding out Hamas. The larger question, or one of the larger questions, and Klaus mentioned this and everyone around here knows this, is how do you conduct a military operation in an urban environment against a well-trained, well-organized terror organization? And this is a very difficult situation the Israeli government and military are in right now. How do you undertake an effective military operation without leading to massive civilian casualties? Absolutely.
What experts have done is they have compared the the urban guerrilla warfare in Mosul, Iraq in 2016, and with the likelihood of something similar happening in Gaza. And they have all come to the conclusion that the expected 3 months fight in Mosul took in the end 10 months to weed out ISIS from Mosul, and at least 10,000 civilians died, and many others, of course, and the whole city was destroyed. And shockingly, Mosul, the wider Mosul area, is actually more or less the same size as the territory of Gaza. And that's the reason why they try to, and also it's very much an urban landscape. So looking at Mosul and the experiences the American military made in Mosul compared with now what's going on in Gaza, possibly, it doesn't inspire you with confidence at all that a quick victory or even a victory as such is possible. And of course, the civilian casualties, civilian misery and suffering would be totally terrible. And we see that already. Cutting off water and electricity and food and medicine is, of course, as the United Nations has said, a war crime. It's against humanitarian law. And while it is in a way understandable, in another way, it's not understandable. And I think that dilemma somehow has to be overcome and resolved. But to see a way forward, I think that will be very difficult. And hopefully Biden yesterday contributed to it by talking to Netanyahu. We have a similar dilemma in Ukraine, don't we? The impossibility to protect Ukraine cities, Ukrainian civilians from the war. How does Ukraine try to do that? Because the Russians also indiscriminately often attack civilian infrastructure, civilian people, rather than focus on military installations. So what is being done in Ukraine to find a way out of that dilemma? Stephen.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and it's really hard. Here in Kiev, we were fortunate to have Patriot missile systems that knock out the most of the Russian missiles that come. And we found some of the things we've learned a lot from this Ukraine war, and one of them is we learned that the Russian hypersonic missiles are still susceptible to Patriot interception. So we're very happy to hear that here in Kiev. And Anya and I went to Kherson last weekend, and we visited one of 2 children's hospitals that we work with that have been shelled by the Russians. And there's no way to protect against that. And here's one of the reasons is Anna alluded to, that the Ukrainians will keep fighting. It's because the stories that come out of the occupied regions of Ukraine, the areas occupied by the Russians, are horrific. Scott had mentioned rape as a weapon of war. We work with an organization that deals with victims of sexual violence at the hands of the Russians, and they get people of all genders there and all ages there. And when I say all ages, I mean that the women skew older. So, and I mean 70 plus, because older women can't run. And this is consistent. We do a lot of work in territories that are recently liberated. And these are older people that stay. They say, I have lived here all my life. What would I do? Where would I go? I'll stay here. I endured the Soviet Union. I'll endure the Russians. And they find out that being in Russian occupation is a lot worse than anything they've endured before. there's been 20,000 children kidnapped by the Russians, and that's just the ones the Ukrainian government has identified. So, there's more than 100,000. We're hearing stories of persecution of Christians. Particularly, there's a significant population of evangelical Baptists, they call it, and these people are targeted and tortured by the Russians in these occupied areas. So if you're a Ukrainian and you're hearing these stories and you know people that are there, Mariupol, Mariupol is horrific what's happened there. You're like, there is no chance I'm going to let that happen to me and my family. I'm going to fight with rocks and kitchen knives and whatever else that I can find, because I'm not going to live under Russian occupation, because I know what that's like.
But it is, and thank you for this impressive narration of what is happening on the ground. But in the end, doesn't it also mean no side is likely to win? That the Russians cannot conquer Ukraine. We saw that and have seen that for the last 18 months. It's totally impossible. But Ukraine will also find it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to get back all of the territory. 20%, 19% they have already lost to Russia since February 20, or earlier, since 2014. So what can be done to end the fighting? You cannot fight to the death and with all that suffering and misery which comes with it. Don't we need to
Klaus, I don't accept your premise. Okay. And here's why. And I'll tell you what I've seen. And this was at the beginning of the war in March. A friend of mine said, hey, I've got these friends that are fighting in Kiev. And this is when Kiev was under siege. She said, they don't have combat boots. Can you get them some combat boots? So I went and found some combat boots. I drove to Kiev and met these guys. And one of them, I said, hey, what's your name? Can't tell you. Where you been fighting? Can't tell you. The guy's like kind of super secret. And I'm like, look, I got some boots for you. If you want the boots, you're going to have to tell me a story. So he rolls up his sleeve and he shows me this little child's bracelet. And he says, I was fighting in Bucha and I was hiding out in this house with this family. And there's this little 10-year-old girl there. And I didn't have a backpack where I could store my munitions. So this little girl went and got her backpack. She poured it out and she gave it to me. I put my munitions in and I went out and killed a bunch of Russians. He said, when I was done, I poured my stuff out and this little bracelet fell out. The girl was long gone. The girl and her family was long gone. And he said that this bracelet fell out because she had forgotten to take this bracelet out. So now I wear it to honor this little girl who gave me her backpack. And now that is a touching story on the face of it. There's two things I want you to notice. One, when he was driving the Russians out of Bucha, he didn't have combat boots because I gave those to him. And when he was driving the Russians out of Bucha, he was using a My Little Pony backpack. All right. And I thought since that point, what if this guy had night vision goggles? What if this guy had real body armor? What if this guy, and what I'm seeing is that you give the Ukrainians the weapons that they need and they will go win. And they're not, so as Anya said, they view themselves as partners of the US. We provide the weapons, they contribute the lives of their very best people. And so there's weapons that have been appropriated by Congress, that have been authorized by Congress, that the Pentagon is not getting here in a timely fashion. Again, M1A1 Abrams tanks, 10 months, and so when we are slow with our contribution, the contribution of the Ukrainians goes up. So it's just this simple. I fully believe that if we get the Ukrainians the demining equipment, if we get them, some sort of superiority in artillery or air superiority, then they can win. They are not lacking in courage or ingenuity. They're lacking in the weapons that they need to win.
Hey, thank you, Steve. Willow, do we have a few more questions?
Yeah, I actually have a question that has been sort of alluded to in the chat as well. But my question has to do with Jerusalem. Many organizations in the UN have floated the idea of having Jerusalem be an internationally controlled territory, but this has received some fairly rigid pushback from both Israelis and Palestinians. It also seems that carving up Jerusalem into the west side and the east side is clearly unstable. And so I know it's a big question, but do you have any sense of the way forward on the legal status of Jerusalem?
Wow, great questions. I think, again, Jerusalem is one of these issues which was pushed back in the earlier negotiations, which were led by the Clinton administration between Ehud Barak and Arafat, pushed back at the very last moment, the last thing to be decided, because it is such a touchy question, and the geography is so intertwined, and in many cases, really people living on top of one another. Although at the same time, we do know that Jerusalem has several 100,000 Palestinians living in Jerusalem as it is. Many of them have not accepted Israeli citizenship. Many of them are living, again, as basically 1 foot in the Palestinian Authority and 1 foot in Israeli Jerusalem. So there is some hope that people can have some kind of way of working out an urban existence with Palestinians and Israelis and Jewish Israelis in Jerusalem itself. How it gets down to, again, jurisdiction over specific neighborhoods, again, Jerusalem as it is, and I don't know anything about any of my 5 wonderful panelists. I know a bit about Klaus, but not that much. But is as it is fairly divided ethnically between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, either, again, Muslims or Christians. And as it is right now, it's somewhat divided city, with people going back and forth to shop and to work or to hang out and to explore. So I don't think it's a total lost cause. I'm not sure bringing in international organizations is going to work. This might be a question for Klaus if we know of situations where international organizations have resolved an urban or an international conflict over a long period of time. But again, I am hopeful, and I have to be hopeful, because if I wasn't hopeful, I wouldn't be having this conversation, having a totally different conversation. At some time in the not too distant future, there will be some kind of way for Israelis and a Palestinian Authority to talk about their differences, and they're talking about them all the time: economic, political, military, religious, and to work out some kind of a way to even work out the thorny issue of Jerusalem. I think it's possible. Do I have that idea here in one of my books? No, but I haven't given up hope that's happening, because I have a strong affinity to and attachment to the Palestinian neighborhoods and residents of Jerusalem who I live in the same city with. And that's one of the reasons why my identity on this Zoom chat board, what it's called, the Zoom conversation, has a hyphen in it or has a slash in it. I'm a resident of both cities. I'm not moving to Tel Aviv because I can't give up on Jerusalem, because I love the interaction with different people, including Palestinians. And sometimes we get along greatly, and sometimes relations are difficult. Right now, with relations what they are now, I wouldn't be walking with my family deep into Palestinian neighborhoods. But there have been many times where these relationships have been terrific, have been great, and will remain great. And my hope is that they will be so, maybe not in 2 years' time, but in the near future.
Thank you. So this is related somewhat to a question Rosemary Ford is asking. She was wondering about the likelihood of a Palestinian state. The West Bank, would that not be a good Palestinian state? Forget about Gaza, which it probably indicates, or what possibility is there to create the so-called two-state solution after all?
Well, we discussed this earlier. I think one of the reasons why, and there are many reasons why, and again, I'm thankfully not a political scientist, but one of the reasons why this massive violence, or this orgy of violence, pardon me, on the part of Hamas exploded 2 weeks ago, as the Netanyahu government was caught sleeping on the guard. And sleeping on the guard means not only not guarding the border, but doing very little, in particular with its new or recent, until a week ago, right-wing government, to basically address the concerns of Palestinians. And this should teach Israelis more than anything that there's no military resolution to this situation. There needs to be a political solution to this situation. And the political solution to the situation needs to be Palestinians taking care of their own business from A to Z. Just as Jews wanted to take care of their own business and created the state of Israel. Some Jews, pardon me, not all Jews, right? So again, I don't think it's going to happen, in particular in events of the past 2 weeks overnight. I think, first of all, Israel's attention is going to be, and the world's attention is focused on the conflict with Hamas and Gaza, but there needs to be an end game. There needs to be discussion about the next day, the day after, as it were, if that's how we say. There needs to be discussion about, again, well, this is basically what happens if you ignore the rights and the concerns of millions of Palestinians. Unfortunately, this is again something Netanyahu, in my opinion, and his government, if I can say my opinion, brought on indirectly himself and the entire country, which should lead anyone to realize that this needs to be resolved politically. The military solution, even if it succeeds, and Klaus mentioned earlier that it may not succeed, and success is a strange term in this situation, but there needs to be a political resolution for both peoples to come to the realization that the time has come to recognize each other's existence and to embrace it, and not to fight over it, not to kill over it, God forbid.
Thank you. I think we have one final question asked by Emma, and then I would like to ask all three speakers to wrap it up and perhaps tell us how we can overcome the bad situation, either Ukraine or Israel, Gaza right now, and if there are any lessons we have learned already from this very long conflict in Ukraine. There's still also very long conflict in Israel, but it's only the recently exploded into that military confrontation. Emma, the final question to you.
Imava Basu asked to Scott, do you believe that the current Israel-Palestine conflict is more a war of imperialism and counter-imperialism, or are religious factors like Arabism and Zionism also relevant?
I think that's for Scott again.
I mean, Stephen and Anna are welcome to jump in, as is Klaus and Willow and even Emma. I don't think the imperial, anti-imperial framework works so well in this situation, for the clear reason that 8 or 9 million Israelis aren't packing up their bags and going anywhere. And that needs to be a recognition on both sides. I mentioned this earlier, and I don't want to fall into cliches, but both sides, or all sides, need to recognize that they're there, that they're here, and to deal with, and when it's framed in the context of an imperial and anti-imperial struggle, then the next step is, the logical step is, well, if you just the imperial regime and or empire collapses, then the local/indigenous people can enjoy their freedom. The problem with that equation in this case is that 8 to 9 million Israelis aren't going anywhere. And so that, and as are 6 to 7 or how many million Palestinians aren't going anywhere, as are millions of other people in the region. No one's talking about massive population relocation and evacuation or transfer at this point in time anymore. And so the equation of imperialism and anti-imperialism doesn't work that well. The second part of the question, I'm not so sure I totally got. I think religion is part of the issue, if that is the question. Was that part of the question, Klaus? To what extent is religion an issue?
Yeah, it was.
Religion is part of the issue, but it's not the only part. It's not the driving part of the issue. I don't think the major part of the problem going on between Israel and Palestinians is religious. Israel defines itself as a state of Jews, but there are easily 20-25% of its population is not Jewish. Many of the leaders of the Palestinian Authority are not, to the best of my knowledge, fundamentalist Muslims. Some of them are even Christians. And so there needs to be a means for coming to some kind of agreement based on economic, political, social, and cultural cooperation in the long term. I don't think we're in a case, and I don't know if this is the question or this is the implication, of two religious fundamentalist groups heading towards an all-out state of Armageddon. I don't think that's the situation. I can clearly say, I won't speak on this part, unless I'm totally wrong, while Israel has a religious component, its main leaders and its main policies are not driven exclusively by religious concerns or religious ideology.
Thank you.
The war with Hamas right now is about physical. One quick question, then I'll give you. The war right now with Hamas is about Israel's physical security and securing the border of that southern region and ensuring that Hamas doesn't strike again. That, in Israel's mind, has very little to do with religion. Steve,
thank you.
Sorry.
Steve, please.
Yeah. And just let me just add to that. So I spent about 3.5 years in Muslim countries after 2001, And mostly, I don't know frameworks of imperialism, anti-imperialism. It's not what I do. I go places, I see things, I ask people questions, and so what I've done is a lot of public opinion research, and there's a large amount of the Muslim world that's animated by the narrative of a caliph. So there's this Islamic extremism that we see that is animated by the idea that Islam should rule. And so I think that when you look at the empire narrative, I think that's something you got to take into account.
Thanks very much, Stephen. We have come to the end. I would like to thank all our audience for asking so many interesting questions and for, of course, staying with us for 90 minutes. Before I let our three speakers go, maybe one final word from each of you. How is the Ukraine war coming to an end? What have we learned from, or what are the lessons we have learned so far already? Anna, would you like to start?
About the war, how war end, I would like to pass it to Stephen. But the more important message which I want to deliver, which I didn't deliver yet, is that my yoga teacher is defending my hometown now. He's fighting over there. My ex-colleagues from work, they're fighting at Zaporizhzhia front lines, and they're progressing because of American weapons. I sleep well in Kiev because I know that patriots can shoot all the missiles that are coming from Russia. And I want to thank every American for this support. Everything we have done so far is because of the support of American people. And that's the main message that I have from me. And Stephen can add about the victory.
Yeah, well, and that is everywhere I go, people thank me as an American for America supporting Ukraine. Sometimes when I show up a particularly rough place and I'm an American, I'm there with aid, and I rattle off a few phrases in Ukrainian, people cry. And so it's one of the best parts of my job to feel the gratitude and to see what these people are going through and walk the walk with them. And so I think that how does this war end? I think that again, the Ukrainians can win if they have the weapons they need. And then, so what does win look like? Well, Klaus, as you pointed out a couple of times, it involves getting to Crimea and cutting off Crimea, and I think that is possible. I think the war stretches out longer than any of us want it to. I think that Congress will. Congress is crazy right now, and so we can't elect a speaker and can't pass spending bills. So, but what happens if tradition in Congress carries forward? You're going to see these spending bills that no one wants to deal with go into December because they kick the can down the road on everything they don't want to deal with. And so, what you're going to see is the spouses and the children of members of Congress become passionate advocates for aid to Ukraine. Just vote for it and aid Israel. Just vote for the aid. Dad, come home. Mom, come home. And so that's going to be a forcing function. And I think you'll see, I rely on the old Winston Churchill quote a lot here, which is, you can always count on the Americans to do the right thing after they tried everything else. And so I say that a lot. And so I think we get the weapons they need to the Ukrainians, and I think America realizes it's in a much bigger conflict with a lot more than just Russia and Hamas. And I think that that ultimately the good guys win, and there's going to be a lot of ugly, unpleasant things between then and now.
Thank you, Stephen. You are an optimist. Let me go to Scott for our final words tonight.
Well, hopefully not the final words for the evening. We'll leave those to you, Klaus. But again, we're only barely 2 weeks into this conflict with Hamas. I certainly hope that one of the first things resolved is the freedom or the liberation or the return of the over 200 Israeli hostages. women, young children, elderly, friends, neighbors. Again, a son of a colleague of mine, Sagita Kalchen, is apparently being held there. I hope they're released. I hope whatever happens between Israel and Hamas, obviously the minimum amount of casualties in Gaza to Palestinian civilians. My sense, and Klaus and I discussed this briefly, perhaps chatting or by phone, or chatting on phone, everyone does them these days, is that the current government and most of the Israeli population are determined to continue this until Hamas is no longer in Gaza. And so whether that's going to happen militarily or through international intervention, I certainly hope that cooler heads will prevail, both among Israel, Hamas, and someone mentioned earlier, Iran and other proxies or other sponsors. My hope, again, is that America will continue its intervention. I think it's been extremely positive up to now, encouraging some kind of resolution both of the hostage situation and encouraging Israel, or just encouraging Israel and discouraging other parties from going too far and for remaining calm. How it ends, I can only hope it ends sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Scott. I would like to thank all of our three excellent speakers, Anna, Stephen, and Scott, for joining us today, for illuminating the issues which we are dealing with right now. Obviously, we have been unable to show a way forward to find a solution, but we have tried, and at least we have enlightened each other and hopefully our audience about the issues at stake here. Thank you very much again. Also, thank you to Emma and Willow for assisting us with our questions and answers. And above all, thank you to our online audience for staying with us, for asking so many interesting questions. And we have an increasing number of loyal Krasno events fans. So anyone who is not yet a loyal fan can, of course, always join us, sign up to the mailing list, and sign up to our YouTube channel. Our next talk will be in roughly 2 weeks' time. That is when Bob Zoellick, the former president of the World Bank and the former US Deputy Secretary of State, will come and join us and talk to us about the global situation and whether or not we can see some sort of reason for optimism regarding the global order and how it is developing right now. Thank you very much for everyone, and see you again, and please stay in touch. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Klaus. Thanks to
Scott,
Willow,
Scott, my
Stephen,
prayers
and Anna.
for-
Great to meet you, and hope to see everybody soon. Thank you.